And now it is Halloween, so we can talk about some spooky Halloween-themed Nintendo games. And there are a plenty of those. I mean, Nintendo is always been kind of known as the squeaky clean kind of company when it comes to at least their first-party content, but it wasn't, not always like so squeaky clean. I mean, they progressed and they evolved and they made some pretty interesting content, but I kind of wanted to talk a bit about you growing up. Like, you had the NES growing up, is that right?
Correct.
Okay, so I was in the same boat, except I was incredibly young. I was about 4 or 5. I was technically, the NES came out the year I was born, but I had an NES when I was like 4 or 5. So I had the classics. I had Mario. I had Ninja Turtles. I had Battletoads, games like that. But the NES was littered with horror games, like games for hard R-rated movies. And I'm not just talking about like Die Hard and Rambo and Alien, which all had NES games, by the way. But there were games based on like slasher horror films. They had Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Maniac Mansion was a port of a PC game back in the day that was pretty violent too. I mean, it's kind of funny. I mean, Maniac Mansion, if you've never played it, it's more like a kind of horror comedy adventure title. There was even like these bootleg games. One was called Chiller. I think you had a light gun with that game, if I remember correctly. But it was a gory NES game. Like, it was crazy gory. So I think it's kind of funny that we look back at this like console that was, I don't know, it had this squeaky clean image, but then you had like Freddy Krueger on the front of a box, like with his knife hands sticking out. And it's like, here you go, kids, play this one, play this game.
I think it's really two factors that contribute to that. One, gaming was not a universally accepted activity. It was still kind of an underground niche hobby.
Yeah.
And also, the 8-bit graphics did not allow for something gratuitous. So you could have your blood splats are what, like little red pixels that appear on the screen.
If you have a chance, you have to check out a video of the game Chiller. It was pretty darn gory, and not just like 8-bit pixelated gory. Like, it was gory. I'm going to give you the opportunity to check that out at some point. It's pretty messed up. There's like a scene, this torture chamber. There's like decapitated bodies and like puddles of blood and a box full of body parts. You can tell why this game never got an official release on the NES. This was like one of the bootleg games. But
I see.
It was pretty crazy, for sure.
Like, the best graphic fidelity that I've ever seen on an NES game that I can think of is actually based on another horror movie, Gremlins 2: The New Batch.
Yeah.
Like, that game, what they achieved with 8-bit pixels were so impressive at the time, and I played that game to death.
Yeah.
It's probably my favorite NES game, if I had to say. That was at a time when licensed games could actually be really good.
Yeah.
And they weren't just cheap cash grabs. Now, granted, those were there, but a lot of the time they were implementing really fun play mechanics and just kind of shoehorning in some kind of movie license.
Yeah.
But Gremlins 2 that's definitely one of the standout games of the NES.
I've never played it. I mean, you're selling it, so I have to try it.
It's absurd. Like, you're playing as Gizmo, and
Yeah.
it's kind of a top-down view, like a Legend of Zelda,
Sure.
A Link to the Past. You're walking around throwing an infinite supply of tomatoes, weirdly, but you can also upgrade, and there are a lot of different points in the game that reference specific moments in the movie.
Yeah.
So if you're familiar with the movie and you're playing through the game, there's a lot of pretty cool callbacks. And they do make some adjustments and modifications, as games are wont to do when it comes to adapting other forms of media. But it was fun. And I had to have played it at least 100 or 200 times through. It's only 5 worlds.
Okay.
And in the NES days, you would have to play a game in a single sitting. Otherwise, you couldn't beat it because there was no saving anything except for Zelda. So,
or you had that complicated like 16 to 18 digit password that
like
games love to do.
Punch Out. Yeah. And I would always mess it up. There was
For sure.
I don't know. As a kid, maybe I was too much of a dum-dum. Maybe I'm still too much of a dum-dum for that kind of that kind of passwords or progress restoration. But it was certainly something I couldn't do as a kid.
Yeah. I mean, there are some pretty amazing horror games on the NES too. One that we never got in the US was a game called Sweet Home. Have you ever heard of Sweet Home?
I have not.
So it was made by Capcom, and Sweet Home was the original survival horror Resident Evil type game. In fact, the first Resident Evil on PlayStation 1 was supposed to be a sequel to Sweet Home.
Oh.
But they obviously changed the name. In Japan, it was to Biohazard. But yeah, Sweet Home, it's really interesting. You're in this mansion, and terrible things are happening. And the graphics were absolutely phenomenal. Did you have a chance to see the Luigi's Mansion demake that we did?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, so the battle mechanics that we did in that demake were kind of based on Sweet Home, where it goes to like this first-person view, and you have to like attack the enemy that way. But Sweet Home was an absolutely fantastic game. I think there are some fan translations of that game that you can get like a ROM for. But if you've never checked it out, it's kind of a really cool piece of gaming history. And it's cool that it's on the NES, especially with its Resident Evil kind of like tie-in.
I was wondering what the inspiration for that Boo battle was, because I was really curious to see how you were going to achieve an 8-bit version of Luigi sucking up these ghosts. But
did you like the Kirby sound effect that was added to that?
I did.
Yeah, Tom Brown is amazing. He is a jack of all trades when it comes to pixel art.
I immediately accepted it as a sucking sound, but I didn't immediately recognize it as Kirby. And then I looked at the comments section, and there was a lot of people who wanted to call that out.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it sticks out like a sore thumb. But
it's a quintessential sucking sound. It's the most recognizable video game sucking sound that there is.
It definitely is. And there's not a lot of other ways that you can convey a sucking sound without that sound. So
right.
What are you going to do?
And Kirby's sound sounds like a vacuum.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's not an accident.
So I'm thinking that on the NES and the Super NES, Nintendo really didn't go the horror route from a first-party perspective. It was all third-party.
Right.
Even on the N64.
Most famous is probably the Castlevania series, which that's probably the first horror game that I ever played, and I was familiar with all of the bad guys from the Universal Monsters series.
Yeah.
So you pretty much check off every single box with just the first Castlevania game. And even though Simon's Quest was almost like unbeatable for a kid, it was impossibly difficult. The music was so good and the atmosphere was so good that I would find myself just walking around until I died. It was definitely scarier. Like they took it a notch further, because it wasn't just you needed to kill all these monsters. You needed to find Dracula's scattered remains, and that's pretty morbid. Like you have to get his nail, his eyeball, I think. I don't remember exactly what all the body parts were, but he's finding dismembered pieces of a body. That's I don't know if they still do that kind of stuff in games. Maybe they do. They're just not the games I play.
If I remember correctly, Simon's Quest suffered from the kind of odd Nintendo of America censorship, where any religious symbolism they would have to completely erase. So if you're walking through a graveyard and there's like a cross, like on a gravestone, the cross would have to be taken off. Nintendo was super touchy about offending the very conservative mothers of the time.
Yet, perplexingly, to present day, the original Link shield still has the Christian cross on it.
Yes, it does. I don't know. I mean, even in the artwork, it's undisputable. That's exactly what it is. But they were very, very picky with the content that came over to the US. Japan had more games where they could get away with, like, there was a couple games that had like pentagrams and like obviously like Satan themes. Like it's a video game. You beat the bad guy, and sometimes the bad guy's the devil. But Nintendo of America was super, super cautious when it came to that stuff. But yeah, oddly enough, I mean, when we move past the N64, because Nintendo had nothing even remotely adult on the N64 from a first-party perspective. I mean, there's adult games on the console. Not many of them are great, with the exception of Conker's Bad Fur Day, which is, just the best.
What a shocking game that was.
So good. On every level, it's so good. I'm not sure if I mentioned this or not at any point, but for my birthday this year, my mother-in-law got me a Conker plush from, like, the original run, and these things are rare as heck.
I think you mentioned that in the last episode.
Was it the last episode? Oh man,
I think so.
I'm staring at him right now. He's beautiful, and I have to mention it every time because God, I love it. But yeah, we moved past the N64 and onto the GameCube, and then Nintendo just decides to be like, F it, we're gonna come out with a creepy, psychological, gory game called Eternal Darkness, Sanctity's Requiem. Was that what it was called?
Sanity's Requiem.
Sanity's Requiem, okay. Which I picked up the day it came out. I was a teenager when that game came out, and I was a Nintendo fanboy at that point. And I'm like, Nintendo is doing a violent game. I remember the headline in Game Informer, and it said, Nintendo does violence, which... It's a really stupid headline, but that stuck with me because it's like Nintendo is going the edgy adult way with this game. And I know you've played it too.
Yeah, a lot, actually.
Eternal Darkness, I'm going to let you have some time on this topic too, but I wanted to bring up Eternal Darkness today because it's kind of like Nintendo's one and done, like, gory horror fest of a title, unless I'm forgetting something completely. Bayonetta, I guess, but that's a combination of like Sega. I think was it Silicon Knights that did Eternal Darkness? Because I know it was like a joint effort. And Nintendo published it.
I don't remember who the other party was, but that game I bought sight unseen. I had reached a point by the GameCube era where if Nintendo published it, I just bought it. Yeah. I had not seen a review. I had not heard anything about it. I didn't even know it was a horror game. I didn't know anything about it. And so once I started playing it and I realized the type of game that it was, I started to question whether or not I was actually going to be able to play it. That's not a genre that appeals to me.
Sure.
I don't have anything against horror games. I would just rather play some kind of fun adventure.
Sure.
I don't like getting scared so bad that I wet myself isn't exactly what I consider to be a fun recreational activity.
Yeah.
But this game did things with story that just completely blew my mind. Now, the dialogue in the beginning is a little contrived, and they need to get the character onto this quest. So yeah. I guess it's somewhat forgivable. They introduce characters that ultimately don't have any relevancy to the story, and we never see them again, but they were just kind of trying to get the protagonist to the inciting incident.
Yeah.
But so I start to acclimate myself to this character, Alex, this female whose grandpa had just recently passed away, and she's inheriting his mansion, and his mansion is terrifying. And then very early on, you get transported to ancient Rome, and you're then assuming the identity of, I think, a legionnaire or a centurion, and I'm not exactly sure. And then they start to continue with that motif where every chapter or so, you're changing the character that you're playing as at a different point in history, and you're revisiting locations from the past and seeing how they evolved over the centuries. And that aspect of the game just captivated me. I found it so fascinating.
A pretty massive Assassin's Creed vibe to it. I think this game predated Assassin's Creed too.
I think so. Oh yeah, it definitely did, right?
But there was definitely this Assassin's Creed vibe to it. But the thing that sold it for me was obviously Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem. The sanity portion of Eternal Darkness was kind of its selling point, where you had a sanity meter and you had to keep yourself grounded in reality when you're in these story segments of the game. And as that meter goes down, the game starts to mess with you in ways that, like, you could walk through a door and your head's gone, and it's like blood popping out of your head, or where your head should be, but you can still walk around. And then it starts messing with you where it will invert the controls and you can't do something and you can't walk. And then it will turn your game off. It won't really turn your game off, but it'll act like it turned off your game. It'll act like it's wiping your memory card, kind of Psycho Mantis with Metal Gear Solid there to a certain degree. I think it did that. Part of me is wondering really now if I'm thinking of Metal Gear.
I'm remembering all of those things, and also it would bring the volume down of the game, like somebody was operating the controller over your shoulder, and it would have flies appear on the screen. I actually physically got up to go swat a fly that was on the screen on more than one occasion, thinking that it was a legitimate fly, and the volume thing freaked me out. My brother has this story that he keeps telling people all the time, where I woke him up in the middle of the night when he was in high school because I wanted to play the game, but I was too scared to play it alone. It's true. I thought that the game was amazing, but there was something about playing it alone at night in the dark that I just didn't have the constitution for.
It's one of these games it's one of these franchises. Nintendo keeps renewing the IP. So they own it. Obviously, I think they do that with all of their IPs in case they ever want to do something with it. I would love another Eternal Darkness game. I would love it if Nintendo would go back to the vaults, and even if they just, on the Switch, there needs to be some sort of like GameCube virtual console at this point, which I never think it's going to happen, but who knows. But even getting it in that respect, I'd be happy. I actually just picked up a GameCube at like a flea market and hooked it up to my HD TV with one of these cheap HDMI cables, and I might pick it up again just to try it. I have incredibly fond memories as a kid playing it. I remember being creeped out. I remember just being shocked at seeing an M-rated logo with a Nintendo logo right next to it, and it was just really good fun. So if you have ever wanted to play a game that kind of makes you go crazy or think you're going crazy, you have to try this one out. A lot of you might be way too young to remember it, but if you have the means of playing it on GameCube or emulation, feel free. It's an absolutely fantastic game.
And the combat system was super cool. You could target specific parts of the bodies of
you could take like their
enemies.
Limbs off too, I thought.
Yeah, you could like attack arms or heads, and different enemies were susceptible to different types of attacks. And you had such a vast arsenal of blades and firearms, and the acting of some of these characters or these actors is phenomenal.
If I remember with the Rome scene, I think the game actually started off in what Roman? What language is that? Latin. This is where you can tell Amiibo Jason's not as educated in this subject as he should be. But if I remember correctly, I think they actually started off in that language, and then it kind of progresses with it distorts and then goes into English. But you could tell they cared about this story. This was not a Resident Evil like, Jill, you are the master of unlocking. Take this lockpick. I butchered the line, but they cared about everything they were doing with this, from the graphics to the hallucinations to the voice acting. I mean, it's just a great game.
One of the characters that's like a ancestor of the main character has this journal, and you're collecting entries to the journal, and when you read them, the voice actor for that character reads them, so he's essentially like performing them. So they're long monologues, and they are
almost Shakespearean to a certain degree.
Good. Oh, I could not believe that. I sat there just thinking to myself how impressed I was with the performance, and it almost broke the suspension of disbelief because of how impressed I was. So that game really hit the mark on a number of different levels, and it had a very H.P. Lovecraftian kind of.
Oh, for sure.
These alien deities that are, I'm making it sound like the fourth Indiana Jones movie, but it was nothing like that. And it even has this complex cosmic rock, paper, scissors mechanic where you choose your own destiny.
Yeah.
Very early on in the game, which I suppose deity you're going to align with, and that affects your aptitude either as a warrior, a scholar, or a magician.
Yeah.
And each one of them is like the typical weapons triangle. So your Pokemon fire, water, and grass mechanic. So it changes the way that the game is played. I accidentally picked the most challenging one the first time.
Yeah.
Because my favorite color is red, and so I was like, I'm gonna go with the red one. But that means all of the enemies are way stronger. So I was like, oh, okay. And they even have like a secret fourth one. So
Yeah.
I think that game's worth going back to. I wonder if the controls would be tolerable for me. At the time, I thought that they were super good. I could
Yeah.
never play Resident Evil, even Resident Evil 4, which a lot of people praise as being the way in for people who had a hard time with the controls of Resident Evil 2.
Yeah.
I couldn't play it. And people even consider the GameCube version of Resident Evil 4 to be one of the best of the entire series. The controls alone were a barrier of entry for me, but I loved the controls of Eternal Darkness. I even kind of wished that Zelda, Ocarina of Time, could have been more like that game, because you had the Z targeting that Ocarina of Time had, but by being able to target specific areas of the enemies, it had a lot more nuance to it than your typical slashing adventure game.
Oh, I totally see that too.